The father wept as he pressed his daughter's hand into a stranger's grip. She did not scream. She did not fight. She simply looked back at him with eyes that held a pain too deep for words. He had sold her, his own blood, to pay a debt. But the man who took her away had no idea, none at all, that he had just placed a queen inside his house, and neither did the prince who was about to walk through his gates. Before we continue, please like this video right now and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story. And tell us from where you are watching us. Stories like this one are why we are here. Now, let us begin. The morning Amara was taken away, the harmattan wind was blowing. It carried red dust across the compound and made the air tastes of dry earth and sorrow. She had braided her hair the night before, not for any celebration, but simply because her mother had always said that a woman must face her hardest days looking like she chose them. Amara chose nothing that morning. But she lifted her chin. Anyway, her name was Amara. It meant grace, and grace, as you will soon see, cannot be bought or sold, no matter what a desperate man signs his name to. Her father, Kwame, stood at the gate of their mud-brick home, his hands trembling, his eyes red with shame. He watched the men from Chief Osafo's household lead his daughter away like a young goat, brought to settle an old account. She did not cry, not in front of them, but the tear that rolled down her right cheek and disappeared into the red dust. That tear, the earth swallowed it like a promise. Something was beginning. Nobody knew what, not even the king's son. Chief Osafo was not a cruel man by the standards of the kingdom. He was simply a man who confused money with morality. His compound sat at the center of Nsawam. 3 great buildings joined by a courtyard of polished stone, surrounded by mango trees so old that the elders said they remembered the time before chiefs. He kept 12 workers, 2 cooks, 3 night guards, and now Amara. She was brought in through the back gate, always the back gate, never the front. This was the first lesson of her new life. She was handed a broom before she was even shown where she would sleep. Amara was 19 years old. Before this day, she had spent her life in the village of Akiyam, a place of small things and good hearts. She had tended her father's yam farm since she was 11. She had carried water on her head from the river every morning before sunrise. She had buried her mother at 16, and after the burial, she had gone back to the farm the very next day, because the yams still needed tending, and grief could not excuse hunger. She was the kind of person the world takes without asking, because the world knows she will not collapse. Her father, Kwame, was not a bad man. That is the most painful part of this story. He was simply a man who had run out of road. 3 years ago, he had borrowed a large sum from Chief Osafo to pay for medicine when Amara's younger brother, Kobe, fell gravely ill. The medicine worked, but the debt grew, compounded by interest that Kwame never fully understood when he pressed his thumb to the paper. By the time the debt had tripled, and Chief Osafo's men came to the compound demanding settlement, Kwame had nothing left. No land, no livestock, no gold, nothing, except 2 children, and one of them was a boy of 14 who could not work. So he made the decision that would haunt him until the day he died. He pressed his daughter's hand into a stranger's grip. Now, in the royal palace of Nsawam, a world away from mud bricks and red dust, a young man was waking up to a life of silk and confusion. Prince Kofi was 24 years old, the only son of King Nana Botung, ruler of Nsawam and the surrounding lands. The palace was carved from golden sandstone and stood on the highest hill in the kingdom, so that from every corner of the land people could look up and see where power lived. Kofi had grown up looking down, but he had never learned to love what he saw from that height. He was not the kind of prince who sat on cushions and received praise. He rode out early every morning, alone, to visit the market and the farms. He ate with the palace workers sometimes, which made his mother, Queen Mother Adwoa, furious in a way she had learned to hide behind a smile. He asked questions that princes were not supposed to ask. Why are these farmers taxed so heavily? Why does the road to the eastern village remain broken for 2 seasons? Why do our people beg for what the palace throws away? Queen Mother Adwoa had answered all of these questions the same way. Because that is how the world is ordered, my son, do not disturb the order. Kofi had never believed her, and that quiet disbelief, that refusal to accept the world as it was presented to him, was the first and most important thing you must understand about who he was, because the second most important thing was this. He was about to ride past Chief Osafo's compound. It was an ordinary Thursday when everything changed. Kofi was returning from his morning ride, his horse clopping slowly along the path that cut between the chief's compound and the market road. The mango trees were heavy with fruit. The air smelled of wood smoke and frying plantain from a woman's stall nearby. He was not looking for anything. He was not expecting anything. He was simply riding. Then he heard her. Not crying, not screaming, singing. It was a working song. The kind village women sing to make hard labor feel like something chosen. Low, steady, rhythmic, the kind of melody that has no beginning and no end, because it was not made for performance. It was made for survival. Kofi slowed his horse. Through the gaps in the compound wall, he could see a young woman sweeping the courtyard with a long broom. Her back was straight. Her movements were unhurried but precise. She sang like someone who had decided, privately and permanently, that no condition would be allowed to steal her dignity. He watched for a long moment. Then he did something a prince was not supposed to do. He dismounted. He walked to the gate, and he knocked. The guard opened it, saw the royal crest on Kofi's riding cloth, stepped back immediately. Kofi walked into the courtyard. The young woman stopped sweeping. For a single moment, she held his gaze without flinching, the way a person who has faced real pain no longer fears the small discomfort of being stared at by a stranger. Then she looked away and returned to her broom. Kofi blinked. In his entire life, no one had looked away from him first. They always waited for him to release them. He walked forward. "What is your name?" he asked. She did not look up. "Amada," she said. "Why are you singing?" She paused, considered the question as if it were more complex than it appeared. Then, "Because the dust does not leave without being asked, and asking is easier with a song." He had no answer for that. He stood there a moment longer, feeling something shift in his chest, a slow, tectonic movement of something he could not name. He left the compound. He mounted his horse. He rode home. But he did not sleep that night. The next morning he returned, and the morning after that. On the third morning, Chief Osafo himself came to greet the prince at the gate, bowing deeply and laughing nervously, and offering kola nut and palm wine. "Your Highness honors my compound," the chief said. "What brings the prince to my small home?" Kofi looked past him to where Amara was carrying water from the well. "Tell me about that girl," he said. Chief Osafo's expression shifted. "Just slightly." A calculation passed behind his eyes, like a cloud behind the sun. "She is a debt worker," he said carefully. "Her father owed me a great sum. She came to settle it. She will serve for 3 years. 3 years. Time stopped. Something inside Kofi did not move for a full breath. 3 years, he repeated. "It is an agreement," the chief said, his voice now slightly defensive. "A legal arrangement. The father signed," Kofi said slowly. "And the daughter, did she sign?" The chief had no answer for that. Kofi looked at Amara one more time. She had heard none of this conversation. She was walking back toward the house, with a clay pot balanced on her head, her spine perfectly upright, her expression perfectly composed, her song barely audible beneath the sound of wind and the mango trees. He turned and walked to his horse. But something had already been decided, in the quiet, permanent way that real decisions are made, not with words or ceremonies, but with a turning of something deep inside a person that can never be turned back. Kofi rode home, and he began asking questions. The palace library held the records of every debt arrangement, land agreement, and formal contract registered in the kingdom for the past 40 years. It smelled of old paper and palm oil and the particular silence of accumulated knowledge. Kofi spent the first evening there alone, requesting scroll after scroll from the elderly record-keeper, a man named Aca who had served 3 kings and never learned to be surprised by anything. He found the record of Quam's debt within the hour. He read it twice, then 3 times. Then he set it down and stared at the flame of the oil lamp for a long time. The original debt was for medicine. That much was true, but the interest clause compounded monthly at a rate that would have been considered exploitative even. By the harshest standards, that clause had not been part of the verbal agreement that 2 witnesses had described. At the time, it had been added later. The ink was darker on that line, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Kofi was looking. He said nothing to anyone that night. But in the morning, he rode not to the palace stables, but to the eastern market, where a man named Atto worked as a document scribe, writing letters and contracts for those who could not read or write themselves. Atto was the kind of man who remembered every document he had ever touched, the way a mother remembers every word her child has ever said. The Kwame contract, Kofi said, sitting across from the old scribe in his small stall. Do you remember it? Atto looked at the prince for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands. I wrote the original, he said quietly. I did not write the interest clause. Who did? Another long pause. The market noise surrounded them. Sellers calling out prices, children running, chickens protesting. Inside the stall, the silence was complete. That clause was not in the document when the man pressed his thumb to it. Atto said, I swear this on my father's grave. He looked up. His eyes were old and tired and completely honest. Someone added it after. Kofi leaned forward, who had access to that document after it was filed. Atto lowered his voice. Only the chief's household. And he stopped. And Kofi pressed. The old man shook his head slowly. There are people in this kingdom, Your Highness, who benefit when certain families stay poor, who benefit when the poor borrow and cannot pay, and their children become workers, and the debt is never quite paid off, no matter how many years pass. He met Kofi's eyes. I am an old man. I have watched this happen many times. The same families, the same pattern, the same ink. Kofi sat back. Something cold was moving through him. Who benefits from Chief Osafo's prosperity? He asked. Who receives payment when he prospers? Atto closed his eyes and said one word. The palace. Kofi rode hard that evening. He went to the village of Akiem himself, without guards, without announcement. He found Quame's compound, a small yard, a crumbling wall, a fig tree with one thin arm reaching toward the sky. A boy of 14 sat outside with a gourd of water, staring at nothing. This was Kobe, Amara's brother, the boy whose life the medicine had saved. He looked up when Kofi dismounted. His eyes were wide and frightened. I am not here to cause trouble, Kofi said, sitting on a stone near the boy. I want to know about your sister. Kobe relaxed slightly. Swallowed. She was always the strong one, he said, and his voice was soft and careful like someone who had been told to be quiet so many times it had become his natural volume. When our mother died, she was the one who cooked. She was the one who went to the market. She was the one who stayed awake when I was sick. He paused. My father tried. He really tried. But the men who came, they did not come like men asking for what was owed. They came like men who already owned everything. They had papers, they had numbers. They had people from the chief's house with them. My father. The boy's voice broke. Just once. Then he steadied it. My father is not a bad man. I know, Kofi said. Is she? Kobe looked at his hands. Is she safe where she is? Kofi looked at the boy for a long moment. She is safe, he said. She is more than safe. She is the reason I am sitting here talking to you tonight. He left the compound with something heavier in his chest than when he arrived. Not despair, something harder. The kind of certainty that comes when the last piece of a puzzle drops into place and the image it reveals is worse than what you feared. Back at the palace, Kofi did something he had never done before. He went to his mother's private meeting chamber without being invited. Queen Mother Adwoa was seated at her carved ebony table, reviewing scrolls by lamplight. She was a tall woman, still beautiful in the way that stones carved by rivers are beautiful, polished by time and pressure into perfect, hard edges. She looked up when her son entered. Her expression did not change, which was itself an expression. "You should have sent word before coming," she said. "I need to understand something," Kofi said, sitting across from her without waiting for permission. The financial arrangement between Chief Osafo and the palace. The percentage he forwards from debt collection. I need to see the record of it. Pause. The lamp flame flickered. "That is not something the prince needs to concern himself with," she said. "I am your son," Kofi said. "Not a child, and I am asking a direct question." She set down her scroll. She folded her hands on the table with the careful patience of a woman who has never in her life lost control of a situation. "Chief Osafo is a partner of the kingdom," she said. "He manages several accounts on behalf of the palace treasury. The arrangement has been in place for 15 years. It is entirely proper. And the debt workers in his compound, the families whose contracts carry interest clauses that were not part of the original agreement, is that also entirely proper?" This time, the pause was different. Not measured. Fractured. "You have been investigating," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. This was more frightening than if she had shouted. "I have been asking questions," Kofi said, "which apparently no one has done in 15 years. She stood. She moved to the window and looked out at the darkened city. "Those people borrow," she said quietly. "They agreed to terms. If they cannot pay, there are consequences. This is the order of things. This is how a kingdom maintains itself, through structure, through accountability, through the children of poor men." Kofi's voice was quiet, but it was the quietness of something that will not be moved. Through a girl swept away from her home with a broom in her hand before she has eaten breakfast. Through a contract altered after it was signed. "Adwo, you are speaking of one girl," she said. "I am speaking of Amara," Kofi said. "But she is not one girl. She is every girl, every child, every family that borrowed in desperation and paid forever." He stood. "And I am not finished asking questions." He left the room. Behind him, Queen Mother Adwoa stood very still for a long time. Then she walked back to her table, sat down, and began writing a letter. The following morning, Ase the record-keeper found Kofi before sunrise, pressing a folded scroll into the prince's hands with trembling fingers. "I could not sleep," the old man said. "I have been keeping this record for 11 years, and I could not sleep." The scroll contained the names of 47 families. 47 families whose debt contracts contained that same darker ink. That same altered clause. Contracts funneled through Chief Osafo's office, reviewed and approved. Kofi saw T mark at the bottom of each, by one person at the palace level. The mark of Queen Mother Adwoa. That same afternoon, Kofi went to Chief Osafo's compound and told him he was releasing Amara, paid the remaining debt from his own personal funds, gave the chief no room to argue. The chief, sweating and nodding, called Amara from the yard. She came out. She looked at Kofi. She looked at the coins he had placed in the chief's hand. She understood. "You do not need to thank me," Kofi said. "I was not going to," she said simply, and in her eyes was not gratitude, but dignity, the kind that had never left. He walked her outside the gate. He was about to speak, about to say something about the investigation, about what he had found, about Hustis, when a rider arrived at full gallop from the palace. The message was brief, urgent, addressed to Kofi directly. He read it. "What is it?" Amara asked. "My mother," he said, "has announced, in a formal gathering of the elders, that I am to be married to Princess Ifua of the Eastern Territories, Eluktup. The announcement was made 1 hour ago. Without my knowledge, without my consent. He folded the message. And the wedding date, he said quietly, is in 3 weeks. The throne room of the Palace of Insawam was designed to make a person feel small. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was cool marble, pale as bone. King Nanabotang sat in his great carved chair, and on his right, Queen Mother Adwoa stood with the composed certainty of a woman who had spent 30 years arranging the world to her satisfaction. Kofi walked in with Ase the record keeper. He was carrying the scroll with 47 names. The court was assembled. Elders in gold-trimmed cloth, palace officials, the chief himself, Osafo, who turned pale the moment Kofi's eyes found him. I requested this gathering, Kofi said, addressing his father but holding his mother's gaze, because I believe a serious injustice has been committed in this kingdom. Not once. Not by accident. But 47 times, with intention, and with the blessing of someone inside this palace. The room went still. My son Adwoa began. I am not finished. He had never spoken to her this way. He could see from her expression that she understood this was not a phase. This was a wall that had finally been walked through. For 15 years, poor families in this kingdom have borrowed in crisis. Their contracts were altered after signing. Interest was added that they did not agree to. When they could not pay, their children were taken, and a percentage of every arrangement passed upward here to the palace treasury, authorized by one signature. He set the scroll on the floor in front of the king's throne. Ase unrolled it. 47 names, stretched across polished marble. King Nanabotang looked down. He had the face of a man who feared what he was about to understand. This is manipulation, Adwoa said sharply. This is a boy who has become infatuated with a servant girl and is now constructing a fantasy to justify. Her name is Amara, Kofi said. 3 words, delivered like 3 stones set down one by one. She is not a servant. She was a daughter, and her father's debt was engineered. Engineered, Adwoa repeated the word with cold contempt. You cannot prove I have the original document, Asai said, his voice thin but steady. I wrote it myself. The interest clause was not in the original. The ink is different. The pressure of the pen is different. I have written 10,000 documents, and I know the difference between what I wrote and what was added afterward. Silence. Then Adwoa said something that sealed everything. She said it quietly, almost to herself, with the weariness of a woman who has been carrying a secret for too long and has finally set it down. I did what was necessary. For the kingdom, for stability. These arrangements kept the treasury funded when the harvest years were bad. If a few families suffered, a few families, Kofi said. And now his voice was not quiet. It rose in the great room and filled all the space under the high dark ceiling. A few families, a girl taken from her father's arms, a father who pressed his thumb to a paper he could not read, a boy of 14 who would have given his own life to save his sisters if he had known. A few families. He turned to his father. Is this the kingdom, Baba? Is this the order of things that I am supposed to inherit and protect? The king had not spoken. He looked at the scroll. He looked at his wife. He looked at his son. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the high windows. Then King Nanabotang spoke 4 words, in the voice of a man who has just understood the full weight of what he holds. Bring me Amara. If this story is moving you, stop for 1 moment, and subscribe to our channel, and click the bell. The ending of this story will change how you see everything. Do not miss it. They brought Amara to the palace gates at sunset. She came, as she always came, straight-backed, composed, wearing no jewelry, carrying nothing but herself. The palace workers who led her in kept glancing at her sideways, trying to understand what was happening. She gave them nothing to read. Her face was calm the way deep water is calm. Still on the surface, full of current beneath, she was brought before the king. Kofi stood to the king's right. Queen Mother Adwoa had been asked to remain, not as a queen, but as a witness. which was a different and lesser thing, and she knew it. Chief Osafo stood near the back of the room, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. King Nanabotang looked at Amara for a long time. Then he said, "Child, your father's name is Kwame. Is that correct?" "Yes, your Majesty." "And the debt he carried, the contract he pressed his thumb to, he did it to save your brother's life?" "Yes, your Majesty." He did not know the contract had been changed after he signed it. Amara paused. Something shifted in her eyes. A careful, controlled unsteadiness, like the moment before a held breath is finally released. "No," she said. "He did not know." The king nodded slowly. Then he turned to Osafo. "The debt is cancelled. All 47 debts are cancelled. The families will receive the return of every payment made against altered contracts, with compensation for the years of labor extracted from them. This order takes effect at sunrise tomorrow." Osafo closed his eyes. He nodded. He did not speak. Then the king turned to Queen Mother Adwoa. She stood very still. For the first time in 30 years, she had nothing to arrange. "You will step down from the council," the king said quietly. "You will withdraw from all treasury oversight. You will face a formal inquiry conducted by the elders, and you will live in this palace, because you are my wife, and I will not dishonor that. But you will hold no more power in this kingdom's decisions." She said nothing. She looked at her son. Kofi held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw, finally, not anger, but grief. The grief of a child who loved a parent, and could not reconcile that love with what the parent had done. She looked away first. Then the king did something that no one in the room had expected. He stood from his throne. He walked, slowly, with all the gravity of his years, to where Amara stood. He stood before her. The Zolkin, with his great cloth and his gold and his power, looked at this young woman in her plain dress, and he bowed his head. "This kingdom wronged you," he said. "And your family?" I bowed my head before no one except God and truth, and the truth is that you suffered what you should never have suffered. On behalf of this throne, I am sorry." The room was absolutely silent. Amara looked at the king. One tear rolled down her right cheek. She did not wipe it. She let it fall. She said, "A king who knows how to say sorry to the poorest person in his kingdom, that king is greater than any palace." Kofi looked at her. He had heard 1,000 speeches from 1,000 people in his life. None of them had ever sounded like that. He crossed the room to where she stood. He did not kneel, but he stood close enough that she could hear him without the room hearing, and he said, "I would like your father's permission, but first I need yours." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the sun was going down over Insawam, painting everything the color of fire and gold. "You have mine," she said. A full 12-month period has passed, as years do. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in a rush, but always carrying everything forward. The village of Achaeum looked different now. The road to the eastern quarter, the one that had been broken for 2 long seasons, had been repaired by palace order, wide enough for carts to pass without losing a wheel. New wells had been dug near the farms. The families whose names appeared on that scroll had received their compensation in full, delivered not by a messenger but by Kofi himself, who rode to each compound, dismounted, and placed the coins personally into each pair of hands. Kwam's compound was no longer crumbling. The wall had been rebuilt with good clay bricks. The fig tree still stood, but now it had company. 3 young mango saplings planted in a row by Kobe, who was now 16 and studying at the palace school on a scholarship signed into existence by the prince he now called shyly. Still getting used to it. His brother Amara and Kofi were married in the dry season, in a ceremony held at the edge of the city, not inside the palace, because Amara had asked that it be done where the people could see it. The elders sang. The market women danced. Kwame stood at the front of the crowd in new cloth, with his hands pressed over his face for the first part of the ceremony, weeping in the particular way that fathers weep when they understand that God has repaired what they broke. Queen Mother Adwa did not attend the wedding. She lived in her palace rooms, quieter now, and some matins in the evenings she could be found in the record room, reading the scrolls she had once controlled. Those who knew her said she had aged a decade in that 1 year. Those who were kinder said she had simply become honest. Chief Osafo retired to his family village and was not spoken of often. And Amara, the girl with the broom, the girl with the straight back, and the working song and the tear that the red earth swallowed like a promise. Amara became the kind of queen that kingdoms write stories about. Not because she wore gold, not because she sat on a throne, but because she remembered exactly what the cold compound floor felt like under her feet. And she made sure every day of her power that fewer people had to know that feeling. She never stopped singing her working songs, even in the palace, especially in the palace. The king who loved her said he could always find her by following the sound. And the sound was always the same, steady, unhurried, unafraid. The song of a woman who had always known what she was worth, even when the world had not. Your value is never determined by your circumstances. Amara did not become a queen because a prince chose her. She was always a queen. The prince simply had the wisdom to see it. And that is the whole story. Thank you so much for staying with us through this story. If Amara's journey moved your heart, if this story reminded you that dignity cannot be bought or sold, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon right now, so you never miss a single story we share. Every story we tell is a lesson. Every lesson is a gift. Watch our next story right here. It is waiting for you. Until then, walk with grace. Her father sold her to pay debt, but the king's son chose her over his princess narration script, short, punchy format, every word preserved, broken for spoken delivery.